What we call talk back. It's just a few moments that we take with our proclaimer or preacher for the morning so we can dive a little bit deeper into the message or connect it to our own lives or even connect it to the life of the church. I've got a number of questions here, so we'll get started so we can go through expeditiously. If you have a question, I encourage you to go ahead and write it down so we can get to it hopefully before the end. But if not, do not worry. We'd love to still take your questions, and then we can always email you a response to make sure that you get your question heard. Okay, so I am here with another question. I got you. Okay, all right. I'm here with our very own senior minister, Reverend Dr. Ben Boswell, who preached today about a treasure hunt. All right. Somebody likes you.
All right, somebody likes me. One person likes me.
All right, so we're going to jump right into the questions. I've already kind of glanced, and we got some really good questions, y'all. But thank you for sharing your questions and thoughts. So the first one is really just asking, can you give us a little bit more specifics? Like, what should we do as individuals and as a church that perhaps we're not doing in relation to your sermon?
Ooh,
starting them off hot.
Sure, yeah, jumping right in. Well, I think... one of the first things to do is to kind of really get our minds wrapped around what Jesus means by kingdom. Okay. I mean, we really need to start there, and we need to start with the fact that there is an economic dimension to his teaching of the kingdom, which is why in the Lord's Prayer, the famous place where he says, the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, there's also, give us this day our daily wages, really is what it should say, and not bread. And then forgive us our debts, which always means economic when it's said, and not sins, although there are many books that you should read about how the word for sin and debt is the same in many languages going back into ancient Canaanite languages. So there's a whole lot to unpack about the relationship between sin and debt. But Jesus is speaking economically. And when he talks about the kingdom, he's got an alternative economic vision than the vision of the world as it was in that day. Now, what I can say where we intersect already is Mojo, our Ministry of Justice and Outreach, one of their 3 pillars and focus areas is economics, and in addition to environment and also, what's the other E? Education, yeah. Important. All 3 critical, and so we are focusing on economics. However, under that pillar, there is so much. And I think we need to think through as a church how to make a bigger impact. So I will say, and this is a radical idea, so I'm not expecting, I know Nancy's and Paula are here. Folks on Mojo, don't do this tomorrow, okay? But I'm gonna put it out there. I'll put it out there. One of our members one time said to me, it seems like year after year as our church budget gets smaller, we're giving less away. So it's becoming more critical that we think about how to make the biggest impact we can. And so in order to do that, we need to think about what we could do as a church that no other church or bank could do, for instance. And so what this person said is once our members are giving to an organization in the thousands and thousands a year, like for instance they are to RAIN, and once those organizations are now receiving Bank of America funding, like say, a roof above. Once the organizations get to that point, our meager 5,000, 10,000, 15 is not what it once was. And we have already done our work for them by introducing our members to that organization. When you go to the RAIN breakfast, you will see more Myers Park people than anybody else. There will be at least 40 people there, and they're beginning to be giving over $100,000 in one day to that organization in a total. We've already done what we need to do for RAIN, introduce them to members who care about them and help those people believe in their mission as if it's our own mission, all right? So that's the first thing. We've made a big impact already in many of these organizations, some of which started here, that we helped start with their founder, but now once they get to the place of Bank of America funding, that's not where we have our biggest impact that we can make. We should be looking at new organizations, startup organizations, folks that are trying to make a new impact in things that we haven't ever done before, that we could fund that nobody else would touch. For instance, things like Transcend Charlotte. Very few churches are going to be giving to Transcend Charlotte, right? Why? Because very few churches are interested in supporting people who are trans, right? So that's something we could do that others could do. But let me tell you the real radical idea. One member said to me, why don't we take the entire outreach budget every year and give it to a different Title IX school. And then the next year, give it to a different Title IX school. And then the next year, give it to a different Title IX school. And then all of our members for the whole year spend time working with that school, just for 1 year, with the money and all of our resources of time and talent and energy. I mean, if education, that's where education, economics, all these things start to come together. I'm not saying we should do that, but I thought it was what I liked about it is it was creative, and it was radical. And that's who we are as a church. And that's how we've got to be thinking. It's not saying that anything we've done in the past is wrong. Everything we've done has been wonderful, charitable, good. We've made Charlotte a much better place as a church. But what could we do now that we're in a different place as a church, the world has changed, and to do something radical. Like all the other churches in the city are giving to Roof Above, for instance, right? And Bank of America is giving to. I love Roof Above. Liz Glaze and Kelly, one of my closest friends. But what could we do? I'll never forget. Some of you know Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. They have a lot. They have a lot of money, but they don't have as much money as the other foundations. They're not as big as the Foundation for the Carolinas. Right. So what Z. Smith Reynolds does is they want to be first to fund. That's their mission. We're going to be first to fund the best new initiatives. They don't try to compete with the Foundation for Carolinas. They want to be on the cutting edge of what's going on. So that's one way I would say we could think about it.
Wow. That kind of reminds me of your sermon a few weeks ago, too, about the seeds, right? About for future harvest. What other seeds can we start with our funds that maybe later the banks and the bigger corporations and orgs can also see?
That's our history. That's what we did with RAIN, right? That's what we did with Friendship Trays. We were the seed planters. And then because of our people and their investment, it became so big, it's way bigger than our church now. RAIN is way bigger than our church, right? The same is true of urban ministries, and I mean, just think about all the different things that came out of Myers Park Baptist. We were the seed planters. But what happens sometimes is when you're the seed planters, you start to feel like you're responsible for also the cultivation for eternity.
Gotcha.
And then you don't have any more money to plant any more seeds because you're spending all your time cultivating that which you once planted. So now you have to say, what does Paul say? It's Apollos planted, Paul watered. We got to think about who are we in the Bible? Are we Apollos or are we Paul? Are we the planters or are we the cultivators? And how do we think about that in relationship to every organization that we fund and that we support? It's also not a bad thing for you to be thinking about in your own individual life. As an individual giver and supporter of things in the community, what can you do that nobody else is going to do? What's your unique way to make a contribution?
I love that. We'll put that quick plug in there for Mojo as well. If you're interested in the Ministry of Outreach and Justice, we've got a few representatives here that they would love to chat with you. So this next question ties a little bit into this. This person wants to know, do you have any kind of advice, though, on addressing this kind of topic? Because we know how people shrink up when it comes to money in particular. Advice on just talking to other Christians about this idea and about this text.
I think one of the things you've probably heard me say 100 times in the pulpit is that Jesus talks about money more than any other topic.
Okay, yep.
And I think that's where we have to start. If we're people who say we're followers of Jesus, we have to ask the question, why? Why would that, even if, let's say that it was written by somebody else and they just decided what parts of Jesus' teaching to focus on, why were those early Christian communities through which the Gospels came to us so hyper-focused on money and on wealth? And wealth as peril and obligation is one way to think about it. Perilous and also creating a sense of responsibility. To whom much is given, much is required. And the more you're given, the more is required, right? I talked about the difference between poor fishermen and maybe where we are in the 1% of Americans, depending upon our household income. And I think we have to wrestle with that reality of the Gospels, where Jesus is. There are a number of books that get into the economic situation and context of the whole Bible, but specifically the Gospels and what was going on at the time. They were heavily taxed. We think about taxes here of what we pay each year, and it goes to support certain kinds of government programs, or the military, or, well, mostly the military, but certain kinds of government programs and things like that, right? Public education. And I know people are all trying to cut all this, but think about in the first century that you were paying those taxes and you got nothing for it. Nothing for it. No defense, right? No protection, no social safety net. You were not just taxed once, you were taxed 3 times, right? Taxed by the temple state, taxed by the political side of that and the religious side of that, and then on top of that, taxed by the Romans. That's where the tribute comes from that Jesus talks about when he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He's talking about the tribute, which is a specific Roman tax that most Jews were opposed to. Taxes and taxation by the Romans are what caused most Jewish revolutions. And most of those Jewish revolutions came from Galilee, where Jesus came from. In fact, many of the disciples, I've said this before, many of the disciples are named after Jewish revolutionaries who tried to take over Rome and failed and were killed, who became martyrs and heroes to the mothers living in Galilee, who named their children after Simon Bar Kokhba, Judas Maccabees, right? And all these great Jewish revolutionaries that came out of Galilee. So Galilee is like the seedbed of revolutionary activity in Jerusalem. And that's almost always because of taxation. That heavy taxation led most people living in that time frame to be in unbelievable amounts of debt. We think we're in debt, but we have methods to pay off that debt slowly over time. They did not have such methods, right? They didn't have, long interest rates and credit cards that they could pay off a couple $100s a month. They had different kinds of mechanisms. Tax collectors, that's why there's so many tax collectors in the Bible. They're going around collecting these taxes from all the people. So in that first century environment, it is economically fraught. We can't read anything in the Bible and understand it without first getting a sense of that economic environment. One of the ways I put this is you have to know what was going on then to know what it means now.
Okay.
What does it mean then to know what it means now? And if we can't know what it means, then if we don't do the study and the research to try to find out more of the economic situation that Jesus found himself in. And so when Jesus does things like come into the temple and turn over the tables of the money changers, right, and the people who are selling things, it's not about some kind of sense of the purity of God's house, which is how I've often heard people tell me, like when they told me one time to get the coffee machine out of the narthex. That's not about the purity of God's house. It's about the economic oppression that most Jews were experiencing, right? And Jesus is turning that over and trying to say, no, we're going to create a whole new economic relationship. And he has a pattern for this. It's not just Jesus pie in the sky, hoping that we all come up with and invent a weird form of democratic socialism. No, he had a model that he's basing all of this on that comes from Leviticus and is then over and over again reiterated by the prophets, and that's what we hear of called Jubilee. You've all heard the word Jubilee before. You go back and read Leviticus 25, you can see right there a pattern, and the pattern is not just a one-time change and then everything gets better. It's something that you have to do repeatedly to re-equal everybody in society and to make sure no one becomes. Right now, I don't know if you know this, that 3 individuals own more wealth than 99% of the population. 3 people. And so that's what Jubilee was trying to avoid, is the kind of radical economic disparity that we have now. And why? How did it do it? Every 50 years, there was a massive redistribution of wealth. And so nobody could ever build up so much over 100, 200 years that everybody else would have to suffer, right? And live under the burden. Because the goal is to create an equal world. And so if we're economically unequal, then we're really not equal. It doesn't matter if we all have rights and privileges given to us by the Supreme Court, which, by the way, can be taken away any moment. There's economic equality is at the heart of what it means to have freedom. And so there's what's happening right now in America is there is a war between democracy, which requires equality, and our economic system, which requires inequality. Those two things are at war with each other right now, and we cannot seem to figure out a way forward with those two things. They're eating each other alive, and particularly the economic system is winning, right? And we're becoming less and less free because of that economic inequality. You think just because we can still wave a flag and come to worship here, that means we're free. But that's one piece of freedom. There's also economic freedom. And that's where the economic system and our democracy are at war with each other. It's hard to see right now who's going to win or what's going to happen. I think every day we all open up the newspapers and look out and say to ourselves, I don't know how this is going to get better. What's the turn that's going to occur to make the change that's needed? And I think that's why we're so needed. We can't always control what happens in the president's house or with Congress or with the Supreme Court, but we can control what we do in our community. And so we have to figure out ways to try to be that presence of light and peace and love and organize together. Not just like this, what the sermon's about is not just going after our own treasure or even our own version of the kingdom for ourselves, but really trying to work together so that we can be stronger in the way that we go out and try to help people who are suffering in this economic disparity situation.
Ooh, thank you for that. And we just got a quick economic and history, socio-historical context all in one. We're going to shift a little bit because this next question is asking about another concept you brought up in the sermon, and that was this very idea of kingdom and kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven. And so someone asked, they hear a lot in church world this phrase of this world is not my home. Have you heard that? What are your thoughts about this phrase, this world is not my home? I guess they're alluding to also a heavenly kind of afterlife concept.
I've heard that phrase many times, and I think it's very dangerous. I had a teacher one time who used to say, this is not me, this is just my earth suit. Right? I thought it was always crazy. What are you talking about, earth suit? But that's what he said. This body is going to go away, so it doesn't really matter what I do to this body, right? So who cares if I, eat or drink myself into oblivion or whatever I do with my body, it doesn't matter because I'm going to heaven when I die, right? That's the same, how we treat our bodies is often how we treat the land, God's creation itself. And so the land, when we say this is not my home, we're saying the same thing. Who cares what you do with this place, right? It doesn't matter because we're all going to go to heaven. And so out of that, what we see is a dominionism that comes from a misinterpretation of Genesis, where we think that we've been given domination over the earth, so we can dispose of it as we want to, use it as we want to, mine it for natural resources, and then throw them all away until they're all mined up, right? And kill thousands of species and not care and don't think that it's going to have any impact on us. And we're dead wrong about that, because if you look throughout the Bible, Jesus is saying the kingdom is coming to this place. We're not going to another place. He's coming here. And the kingdom that he's having is coming here. When I was in seminary, that whole rapture thing was really big, where it was, by the way, rapture was an idea invented by a guy named John Darby. It's just a lie. And it was put in the Schofield Bible as a footnote, and then everybody started believing that it was actually real, and it was just a footnote in a Bible. So it's BS. It's not even a good interpretation of Thessalonians. So anyway, this rapture idea that we're all getting taken. Well, I'm in seminary class, or I guess this was undergraduate, and I had a professor say, that passage you think about when it say there was one in a field, there were two people in a field and one was taken and one was left, right? The rapture says you want to be the one that's taken. But this professor had gone back and his whole dissertation was on absolutely not. You want to be the one that's left. Because the kingdom's coming here. You don't want the one that's taken, that's the one taken away to what? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. You don't want to be the one taken because the kingdom's coming here. And so it's a total reworking of how we think about the Bible, right? All these passages that have been about getting caught up in the sky and going off into some glorious place. That's really not what it's been about at all. It's about what do we do to make this world into the kingdom, right? And how do we live out kingdom life here in this space? So I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking. I also think it's leading to, in addition to the climate catastrophe, anybody feel hot this summer yet? There's some there's some scholars writing about the way in which environmental movements, this may be our hope, by the way, the way in which environmental catastrophes changed the politics of major empires throughout the world history. So many don't know that there was an environmental catastrophe that precipitated the fall of Rome. I could send you links on this if you want to read more about it. And that changed the politics and economics of the Roman Empire forever. So there may be hope that the environmental struggle, crisis that we're in could disrupt the American political system in a way that would probably be really bad at first, but could lead to something better in the long term. And to show how close we are with things and how embedded we are with creation. Small, tiny little economic changes can lead to things like COVID-19 and what we experience, and for instance, AIDS. Research has been done. I don't know if you remember this. Remember back in the 80s and 90s when they told you that the reason people got AIDS is that somebody got bit by a monkey and the monkey had AIDS, right? Remember that? Actually, what we've learned now is that the reason AIDS was transferred into humans is because people working around monkeys got so poor and so hungry, they started eating the monkeys because there was nothing else to eat. And that's how we got HIV, right? So think about that. It's actually the economics that leads us into a situation where people are so desperate that humans and animals come into the kind of contact they don't belong in, right? Some people believe that COVID was released from a lab, right? The lab release. Others believe that it was a wet market where people were eating things they shouldn't be eating because there was nothing else to eat. And so people consuming animals that they wouldn't necessarily ordinarily be consuming, right, leads to the outbreak. What's that showing? We're in such close proximity with nature, even now in a modern industrialized world, that one change in the economic situation that causes us to have to do something desperate to survive could lead to an outbreak that kills half the world. That's how close we are to creation. So we have to wrestle with I don't know if any of that's true, but I think that some of that is important for us to wrestle with. I mean, yeah, thinking about it, it's like, this is not my home. That's an irresponsible way to think about the earth. Yeah.
I'm glad you addressed that phrase because it reminds me of some of the counter civil rights activists that were trying to get an idea out there that, there's something heavenly to worry about. Don't worry about what's happening here now. There is no war happening. There is nothing. Your rights are not important right now because you're going to get to heaven. Yeah. So, yeah, it's propaganda. All right. So I think this one, if I can read it correctly, is referring back to the text where they said one son had to keep what they found too rich. Another found the good from the bad. If you could explain the two outcomes and why this idea, I guess, that some are not going to, quote, heaven.
Okay, so I as pastoral privilege, didn't spend as much time on the net parable as I maybe could have. I talked about weeping and gnashing of teeth, and I talked about the dentist office. Hopefully you won't forget that image. No. Okay, so about the net. Here's the thing we have to acknowledge as progressives. We can say we don't believe in hell, and many of us don't, and we don't believe even in heaven, many of us don't, or resurrection in the way that it has been traditionally. But what we can't do is pretend that the Bible doesn't have something, you might call it, about judgment. There is this thing going on in Jesus over and over again where he describes, and I would say, an eschatological event that takes place at the end of history, where the word I would use for it is not judgment, but a sorting, right? Even our favorite passage as progressives, Matthew 25, right? When did you see me hungry? When did you see me weak? Do you remember how that starts? They're the sheep and the goats, right? That whole passage is about a sorting. It's about you might call it a judgment, a sorting that's going to happen at some point in time. And that sorting keeps being metaphorically described as some people going over here to kingdom, right, and living in this beautiful era of peace and love and harmony and equity, and other folks going over here to a place that's like the dentist's office, right? Okay, so why do we need to talk about it as progressives? We can just avoid those texts if we want to. That's fine, but it's also not very responsible. We have to engage them and be serious about them. I think because they're there and they don't just disappear because we don't interpret them. And I think there's a way of interpreting them that can help us in the world of religion. It could help us have a conversation with folks who also see them there and want to spend a lot of time on them by saying, look, every time Jesus talks about it, he says it's at the very end of history and it's not up to humans. It's at the very end of history and it's up to humans. Why does that matter? I had this, when I was in the Army, we used to have this saying, forgive me now because this is you're not going to like this, but we used to have this saying, kill them all and let God sort it out. Right? Kill them all and let God sort it out. Right? That's what they, you go into combat, right? And you're just kill everybody and let God figure out who's good and bad in the end, right? There's something, half of that statement is right. Right? It's let God sort them out. That's the statement. The first half of it, I would not authorize. No. Right? So we could say as the church, love everyone and let God sort it out. So what we have to do is withhold. When we look at these judgment passages, we can say, yeah, they're there. But that's not about us. That's not our job. Human beings never get authorized in the biblical text by Jesus or otherwise to engage in the judgment. That's not our job. So when people say, no, we've got to decide who's saved and who's not. Nope. We got to decide who's in and who's out. Nope. That's actually exactly the opposite of what it says in the text. It always says it's God's to figure that out. And God could decide to let everybody in. So we're going to let God figure all that and do whatever God wants to do. We have to get out of the business of judgment. And, Paul says that too, right? Judge not lest you be judged. Jesus also, right? So every time Jesus talks about this grand sorting that's going to take place, he's always careful to say it's God's, not ours, to work on. And so we don't really have to worry about it. And we should never focus our time and energy on it because it's not something we're equipped to do. We can't know, like looking back at the other parable that comes before this of the weeds and the wheat and the weeds. We don't actually know in that parable who's who. That's right. We're not the gardener in that one. We don't get to be the gardener. We have to, Jesus is telling it to us so that we understand why there's evil in the world. Why there's evil in the church. Right? Why there's people in the church who don't look like they're following Jesus. Right? That's what Matthew's struggling with in the first century. These folks are coming up to him and say, hey, Jesus died, then was resurrected. You told me we're building this thing called the church. Why is this person still sinning? They were baptized, right? They're following the same thing we were following. I thought the world was going to change. Shouldn't we kick them out? We got to kick these people out. And so Matthew has to say, no. We don't kick them out. We live together as weeds and wheat. We don't get to know who's who. That's part of the way the world is. It's just the way it is. We live. Some of us are evil, some of us are good. Sometimes the line between good and evil runs through each individual human being, right? We lose, the net is the same. All the fish are gathered. Actually, the word fish isn't in that text on that. Everything you could gather in the ocean is gathered by a drag net. That's what they're talking about in that passage. Even stuff that's not fish, that's inedible. So everything's dragged in and dropped in the boat. And then it's not up to us to do the sorting. And so I think that can help us with these passages on judgment is to get out of the business and leave that up to God. Now, you might say, I don't want to follow a God or believe in a God that engages in some kind of judgment. Fine. I'm with you, okay? That's great. But they're there, these stories, so we have to figure out what to do with them.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up specifically the text about the wheat and the weeds, because that comes to this other, more of a comment where someone say with the Matthew text, the evil being thrown into that furnace of fire, that they can't even hear any message after that. It stops them in their tracks to hear that kind of message. So do you have any other thoughts on that? You kind of answered.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible, it's just interesting. This has given me an opportunity to talk about something we've been talking about as a staff, and that is about people being triggered by what's being said from the pulpit or even in a scripture. This is an example. I didn't say that. Jesus said that. So be mad at Jesus, right? Here's the thing we have to wrestle with. I mean, we're in an age now where folks have to take care of themselves, and we do need to give certain kinds of latitude for folks to be able to care for themselves who have had experiences of serious trauma, right? But our story is based on a person who died on a cross, who was crucified on a cross. That's our story. So that's the trigger warning. There's no other trigger warning coming. Everything we talk about is going to have to deal with violent death at the hands of empire and everything related to it. So there's not going to be another separate one where we say, hey, this sermon Sunday is going to be about gun violence, take care of yourself if you need to. No, every sermon, every message, everything we do is going to be about something tough, because our whole faith is centered around a person who was crucified on a cross in one of the worst forms of execution the world has ever created, by an empire that was doing this all over the place, not to poor folks, to revolutionaries, right, to people. If that's the center of our faith, then it's going to mean that every time we come in here to this space, we're going to have to deal with stuff that's not easy. Death, right? Pain, oppression, individuals being harmed. That's part of what we do in here. We do serious stuff in the church. It also means we come here to try to find hope and a way forward. We don't just leave people sitting right at the foot of the cross, as you might have heard of the Baptist church, right? A different Baptist church. We don't just do that. We want to also give people hope and a way forward, a way to live, a new world, a new vision, new creation. But we all have to be prepared to come in here and deal with hard stuff, because the center of our faith is a person crucified, right? So I think about it like this, and I've said this in a sermon. You've got folks out there right now saying, you can't teach children about slavery, right? Ban all those books. Those same folks are going to church on Sunday and showing their 3-year-old children pictures of the crucifixion. Now, give me a break. The only way to do that is if you've already sentimentalized the whole gospel, right? And you don't want to talk about slavery or lynching, but you're going to go talk about the cross. It just shows how we have compartmentalized our faith, particularly in the evangelical world. Like, we can go over here and we don't want our children to hear about anything hard over here, but on Sunday morning, we're going to come in here and we're going to talk about a faith. There's stuff in this weeping. We're going to talk about hell. We're going to talk about weeping and gnashing of teeth. The Old Testament's, Hebrew Bible's filled with horrible stories. Rape, murder, awful stuff. We're going to teach all our children those stories, but we're not going to teach them about slavery. It's just an obvious form of denial, right? It's just so obvious it's not even worth arguing about. But that's one of the things we have to reckon with as people who are trying to keep all this together and not compartmentalize our lives. We want to deal with economics, politics, faith, religion, all at the same time. We're not going to compartmentalize them. Otherwise, we're going to fall into the same traps that others have fallen into for years and years and years. So that's part of why we have to deal with that.
That's good, yeah. So we talk about the hard things here.
Yeah, talk about the hard things, yeah.
Okay, well, here's another hard thing. This person, you mentioned in particular about like the stock market and gambling. So there's a clarity question here. This person says, so are you saying that one should not invest in the stock market because it is gambling? Parentheses, do you not invest any of your retirement funds in the stock market? There's a risk-reward trade-off, right, in many areas of life. The examples they lifted up were safety features in cars and planes, so we can move about more rapidly than walking. Risk can be managed in the stock market too. All of life is a gamble. So how do you reckon that? Stock market, gambling, is it a risk-reward? What is the difference?
I think the person misunderstood. I don't have any problem with gambling.
No. There you go.
Yeah. I don't have any problem with gambling. I was using those as examples. They're just examples of what people who know money can change your life. Right? That's people who bet. Look, I don't know if you've noticed, but you can't watch anything in any television show now without being some advertised for DraftKings or one of these. When I was a child, you would never see an ad for a gambling on television. Right. That would be unheard of. Not only was it not legal, right, you wouldn't even talk about that, right? It's one of those things, in addition to dancing, you just didn't do. You just don't even talk about. It was not for church. We don't talk about gambling is bad. Gambling is bad as drinking, right? Now it's like, come on, you can't do NFL football without gambling, right? That's what they're trying to tell you. Constant ads, the Mannings are in them. It's become like just like another thing we do, apparently, which is, whatever. That's the thing. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not trying to get up there and rail on gambling or on investing in stocks or on buying a lottery ticket. All of those, I'm saying, are examples of the fact that people know money can change your life. Okay. And what I'm doing is comparing that to Jesus, who's saying, yeah, I know. And the fisherman, yeah, I know money can change your life. The kingdom can change your life too, and it will change not only your life, but the whole world. Lottery tickets just going to change your life for you and your family, probably. Maybe a nonprofit that you like. But the kingdom is going to change everybody's life. And so Jesus is trying to get people focused over here, right, and not over here. And I think a lot of us are focused over here, right? How much of what did I say in the sermon? This quote kind of came from my wife. All of us are sort of like living in such a way that we are hoping to escape the financial ruin of American society, hoping that we're going to get enough money that we'll be able to survive the coming apocalypse or the current apocalypse. That's our goal. Instead of working together to try to make the economic situation better for all people. Do you see the distraction? All of our energy is like, I just got to go work. I just got to keep grinding. Got to get that next dollar. Got to get that next promotion. Got to get that next thing. You know, grind. Got to work on Saturday. Got to work on Sunday. Got to work on Monday. Grind. Nobody ever stops to think, should we all have to live like this? Why are we living like this? I'm over here grinding. People are living in tents over here. There's housing. I don't know. Robert Doolin was here earlier. He told me that the average home price in Charlotte that was sold in the month of June was $580,000. Who's going to live in that house that's poor? Who's going to live in that house? Poor folks can't live there. That's where we're headed. All the skyrocketing home prices, cost of living, it's just getting worse and worse, I think we've got to figure out. Here's the thing. I don't know. It's like activists say this all the time. They build cages for some folks, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's just for them. But they're building enough cages that they could put all of us in one eventually. And I know that's a metaphor. I'm not saying they're actually going to lock up white men. That's not happening soon, right? Not just for being white men, right? But the system is going in such a way that more and more groups are going to get impacted negatively. Sure. Even those who used to think they didn't. Think about, for instance, like the recession and how many children had to go home from college after graduating with a degree to live with their parents. You remember reading about all those stories? The world hasn't gotten any better since then. Wages have not gotten any better since then, right? And so it just keeps getting worse, right? And people are having to find more and more unique ways to try to survive in this. And I think what I'm trying to say is, instead of focusing on our survival or some way of trying to get out of this or escape it or get above it, we should be working together to try to make it better. And I think that's totally different path.
Right. That's why I was really excited for like the UPS workers and their unionization striking.
Yes.
Because so many people were looking like, well, you just, what about you? You go do your family, worry about the individual. But to see them come together to say, no, we all can do so much better, and keeping the focus on the right area. Right,
and the writers too.
The writers strike as well. So, all right, we're drawing near the end of our time. We've got 2 more questions, so if you all will stick with us, we're going to get to these 2 questions. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay, you got to talk to me. I can't read minds anymore. All right, thank you. All right, so this one says, some, quote, treasured, I love how they use that, hymns have Civil War references and even some contradictions, though, in them. And they also quoted the "In the Sky, Lord, in the Sky." So what do we do with that?
Oh, well, you may have noticed that a number of the pieces of music that we sung today were old tunes that we used to sing in church growing up, but with new words. We could thank our new minister of music. Yeah, there we go. Clap to it. Give a clap offering to God. So we can give thanks to our minister of music, Kevin Gray, for writing new lyrics. He does that every week. I don't know if you noticed sometimes. He's always writing. And I think that really is helpful for us as a church because we once had a person in a minister of music search process look at us and say, there's no music written for your church's theology yet. So you're always going to struggle to find ways to sing the stuff that everybody knows and have it match the theology of who you are. That's true. Because there's no music written for the theology of your church yet. That's not really true if you look outside the church. If you look outside the church, there's all kinds of music written for our theology, in jazz and hip hop and classical and rock, all these places. But in the church music is typically not written for the progressive, justice-seeking liberation-seeking theological church community. So Kevin's having to write stuff weekly, but we pin it to an older tune because those tunes, it's the tunes that are the heart songs of the church that we grew up with that remind us of where we were when we sat with our grandmother and our great-grandmother in church and worshiped years and years ago. And we need that memory, right, which is what church does. Memory goes back and remembers the story of Jesus and the story of the deliverance from Exodus. We need that memory to provide us strength for going forward in the fight. Without that memory, we're trudging a trail all by ourselves that's brand new. But actually, people have been fighting this fight for a long time. People sang that song, and they sang "To God Be the Glory," and they sang it with the original words, and some of them still went out in the world and tried to make it into a good place. So we can draw back on that. It's interesting because in the passage today, it says, there's a line, it says the disciples, those, he calls them scribes. It's the only place that Jesus calls the disciples scribes. Scribes who are trained in the kingdom will be able to bring out treasures new and old. Isn't that beautiful, right? Not everything's not just newness for newness sake.
Right.
It's a new way of riffing on the thing we once did. And that's what we're doing with music here. It's also what we're doing with reading scripture, how we're reading scripture. It's what we're trying to do with programming. And in the kingdom itself, Jesus' own vision of the kingdom has both new and old. I mentioned Jubilee was very old. The prophetic writings were very old, where it says, in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And Jesus then riffs on the Isaiah and says, no, Isaiah 61 is now, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to do, draw back upon that in the old that we remember that was good and a vision of the kingdom and a way of being and living together that was better than the way the world is now and more holy, drawing back on it and riffing it for the new world and trying to make it work in the new, so.
That.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so this is our final question. This person writes that the sermon reminds me of the question recently asked at a conference entitled, "Can the Church Change?" What is your answer to this question? That's a perfect closing.
Yeah. Can the church change? Yeah. I mean, of course, yes. But it's hard. So the answer is yes, but it's hard. The first thing is the church has changed. If you've been in this church for more than 2 months, it's changed, right? It's changed. Things are changing. There's more diversity here. The music's different. When I came, the choir was processing with the clergy in robes every Sunday. Things are different. The liturgy's different, and a lot of things are to blame for that. Your clergy, but also the fact that we had COVID and that changed how we did worship, and members of the church coming to us saying there's too many barriers. I can't connect to the music. I need something different. And so we've been trying to receive this feedback and evolve. And some folks feel like we've evolved at a rapid pace, an incredibly rapid pace. Others feel that it's been rather glacial. And that's a matter of social location and perspective, right? Where you stand in relationship to the change determines whether you like it fast or slow. If you didn't like the music before 2016, right, you're loving what's happening and you wish it would happen faster. If you loved the music prior to 2016, then you think the changes have been incredibly fast, right? Super fast. And so it's all about how we exist in relationship to change, right? Everybody says, well, things are changing too fast. That's because they don't like it. Right? They don't like the change. For some, the change is too slow. So all of that is, that's one thing. I will say the church will not change unless it is provoked. Paul says, provoke one another to love and good deeds. And so, I like to provoke things from time to time. I don't know if you knew that about me, but sometimes I like to provoke things. But I think I'm not trying to provoke people to a place that's going to do me any favors. It's not for me, right? It's all about how we can be better, or even just live up to what we've said, right? That's some of the things that the great civil rights leaders of the past have done with America. Just call it to live out the words it already said, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Freedom and justice for all, right? Just try to get it to live up to what it said. And that's what we're trying to do here. We've said some stuff as a church. strong things. Our covenant, our statements, we've said some strong things. But living what we said is always harder than just saying it. And now we're trying to live it. We're not trying to live what we said when we said we're going to make this statement on racism. We're trying to live what we said when we said we're going to make this statement on immigration. We've made this statement on LGBTQ inclusivity. But now we have to live it. And this is the thing with integrity. It's so much harder to do than it is to say. Look, we have the whole Bible, the whole book of James is about that. Yeah. And so what we're supposed to do as leaders is to try to help the whole congregation work together to live up to what we've already said. And that is not always easy, as some of you are. I can see you smiling back at me. No, you've been in some of these meetings. You've experienced this. It's not easy, but I think it's what we're called to do. And we can choose to do it in a whole bunch of ways. We can decide we're going to fight each other about it, or we can decide that we're going to try to work together for it. It doesn't mean we're going to agree, right? We're not going to always agree. But if we decide that we're all in it together, right? This is where the Barbie land comes back together. You know I was going to mention Barbie. This is where Barbie comes back. Barbie, they decide that the Kens are going to be apart, right? They're not just going to be there anymore doing nothing. They're going to be a part. They don't agree. They don't want the Kendom. They don't want to be dominated anymore. But they're all going to work together on a common mission, on a common goal, living together. That's what community is about.
I love that. I think the closing thing is for us all to go see the Barbie movie. Excellent. But seriously, thank you all for sticking with us. We went a little over time, but we had some really rich discussion. Thanks to our senior minister, Reverend Dr. W. Benjamin Boswell, for sticking with us as well. We'll see you all next time. Same place, different preacher.
Yeah. Tara next week.